Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
In the 1940s, psychologist Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark conducted the doll test, a cognitive evaluation on African American children to demonstrate the psychological traumas of school segregation. In spite of the previous 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson separate but equal ruling, most African American schools had little access to adequate funding and promoted a mindset of inferiority in African American children, thus creating a barrier to a strong education. The Clark's revolutionary doll test was used in the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education case, thereby allowing the legal team to convey the psychological impact of segregation on African American children. Through showing that the separation of African American children in society not only generated feelings of psychological inferiority, but also created notions of harmful racial superiority, the doll test was instrumental in breaking the barriers of school segregation, thereby becoming a major turning point of the civil rights movement. During the Reconstruction era, many Southern legislators rewrote their state constitution to allow the legal segregation of public spaces based on race, diminishing the rights of newly freed slaves. Though these constitutions were challenged in the 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case as a violation to the equal protection of the 14th Amendment, the appeal failed. The court issued a separate but equal ruling, legalizing segregation and upholding these prejudiced state constitutions for the following decades. Jim Crow created barriers to education in the South by segregating schools. Schools for African Americans were in session 2 fewer months than white schools, had inadequately trained teachers, and lacked proper resources like textbooks and space. In 1918, it was reported that 31.3% of African Americans over the age of 10 were unable to read and write, while only 6.4% of the white population was illiterate. Discrepancy in funding was also evident, with some states having a disparity of more than 10-1. Segregation barriers not only created unequal access to education, but also made a significant impact on the psychological state of African American kids, leaving lasting impacts throughout their lives.
It means to live in a world where you don't see yourself as beautiful, you don't see yourself as desirable, you don't see yourself as smart, and then you have to walk through a world in which you're putting other people at ease all the time, before you even get to the normal things that life and adolescence throws at everyone.
Doctors Kenneth and Mamie Clark had become leading psychologists and had conducted a series of field studies on cognitive and developmental psychology among children. This led to their groundbreaking study, the doll test. Administered by the Clarks, the doll test aimed to communicate to colleagues in psychology the influence of race and color and status on the self-esteem of children, as well as to better understand and heal children's hostile racial biases. The doll test was relatively simple. Children ages 3 to 7 who attended segregated schools in Washington, D.C., and integrated schools in New York were presented with 4 dolls, each identical in every way except for their skin color. The children were then asked a series of questions about the dolls, ranging from identifying physical traits to associating these traits with different personalities. Through these experiments, the Clarks found that African American children attributed darker skin tones to that of malevolence and inferiority, while white dolls were attributed to that of beauty and kindness.
That doll pretty.
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
In their results, they also found that 2/3 of the subjects believed the white doll was better than the black doll. 59% of children stated the black doll looked bad, compared to the 17% of children that said the white doll was bad. The Clarks argued this data demonstrated serious psychological impacts as a result of social segregation and had already begun to negatively impact their sense of self-worth. These results were supported by the data, of which only 38% of children thought the black doll was a nice color, compared to the 60% that believed the white doll was a nice color. By testing multiple age groups, the Clarks identified that this prejudice was hardly innate. Instead, as children were further exposed to discrimination in their life, their self-esteem plummeted. Children age 5 had much more white bias compared to their 3-year-old counterparts. In 1951, Oliver Brown filed a class action lawsuit against the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, with the help of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, after his daughter was denied admission to an all-white school. He claimed that schools for black children were not equal to white schools, and argued this rejection violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This class action was combined with 4 other individual cases, all concerning public school integration, under the heading of Brown versus the Board of Education in the Supreme Court. Working within a racially biased legal system, the team of lawyers in Brown versus Board sought indisputable scientific data to prove that equal opportunity in education was impossible under Jim Crow law. Robert Carter, one of the Brown's lawyers, who was familiar with the Dahl test, believed the study could prove that segregation caused serious adverse psychological effects on African American children. These effects would cause African American students to underperform in school and make it impossible for them to receive an equal education. Dr. Kenneth Clark was called as an expert witness and testified in 3 out of the 5 Brown versus Board of Education cases. This was the first time social science research was used in a Supreme Court case. His expertise provided insight into a child's perspective of social justice that was unheard of at the time. Because of the Dahl test findings, the court ruled unanimously that separate but equal schoolings was unconstitutional on May 17, 1954. The psychological testimony was key to winning the case. This ruling not only led to school integration, but also set a legal precedent that would be used to overturn laws enforcing segregation in public facilities, thereby breaking the barrier to racial integration. Between 1956 and 1963, the support of school integration in the South doubled, with 200 school desegregation meetings occurring in support of Brown versus Board of Education, thus showing the social impact of the case. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act gave the federal government the ability to enforce school desegregation. Within 5 years, nearly 1/3 of African American youth in the South attended integrated schools, but that figure reached 93% by 1973. Frustrated with the still evident racism in society, the Clarks worked to break the stigma of handling children's mental health surrounding discrimination. The Clarks Northside Center for Child Development used the findings of the Dahl test to provide psychiatric and academic services to children. Mamie Clark's comprehensive efforts to ameliorate the pain attached to skin color have had a lasting impact in the field of child development and the psychology of race. Her vision of social, economic, and psychological advancement for African American children resonates far beyond the era of integration. While the Brown versus Board of Education case provided great leaps by abolishing the segregated school system, students of color still face discriminating inequalities in the education system today. Just 8 years ago, CNN commissioned a re-examination of the Dahl test and found that despite political changes, the social oppression of minorities is still very high. The test showed that nearly 85% of white children identified the African American child as bad, and almost 60% of African American children identified their own color as bad. These results thus show the racist tendencies that are still found in future generations. Furthermore, the integrated school system is hurting African Americans' perception of themselves.
I've been bullied for the way I look. I tried not to break. I couldn't hold on anymore. So I asked my mom, can I leave?
Due to discriminatory policies in schools, disadvantaged African American youths fall into the school-to-prison pipeline. African American students are 3.5 times more likely to be suspended or expelled, and account for 46% of students who are suspended more than once, despite only constituting 18% of the population. Federal research found that children of color suffer much harsher penalties for the same behavior than other similarly situated white children. This shows that even with the barrier of school segregation broken down, there is still a barrier to equal education for African Americans.
What does it mean to get on the elevator every single day and have to remind people that you are not a threat? What does it mean over and over again to have to be subject to being othered and code switch so that you can make other people comfortable simply because your very presence makes them uncomfortable?
The 1940s Dahl test was used to break barriers to racial integration in the Brown versus Board of Education case. However, discrimination is not only found in the past, but in our present. Today, laws can't regulate the racism found in classrooms, in hallways, or in one's mind. The issues we face today are not only fought in courtrooms, they are fought in every classroom, in every hallway, and in everyone's mind. The work of the Clarks was used to abolish an unethical legal system, but today their work must be used to abolish an unethical social system. Every child, in every classroom, in every hallway, deserves the right to equal education.